Watch this. No way!
We usually go south, the guests, after 3. How have you been keeping for our listeners' benefits? How are you? Are you well? How was your weekend? Just sort of.
Well,
give
as
us
you
a
know,
bit of an
Sam,
update.
I'm reasonably damaged, as are you, from the festivities on the weekend. Feel a bit better today. Definitely slept a bit better last night, but yeah, we had quite a golf festival on the weekend, didn't we? 72 holes in 2 days. Little bit of drinking in between rounds of golf.
A little bit.
But I think the
and a lot of
biggest
foursomes
recovery
match play.
biggest recovery that I'm having to make is missing that 3-footer on the last, which was been quite damaging to my overall mental state, to be honest with you, especially as it meant I had to relinquish my unbeaten record at foursomes against you.
Never mind, hey. Anyway, I wanted to bring that up just to check how you are. James, we've got you on the podcast today, not to talk about your eclectic 18 or to recap the Open Championship, but instead help us pick through the recent announcement by the R&A and the USGA about it's not bifurcation, it's not a rollback, it's a consultation period about an MLR. Try and pick between the nuances of the language and the detail that goes into it. You know a little bit about ball technology. Obviously, you know a lot about club technology, but you've taken a ball to market, haven't you, in the past?
Yes. I guess you sort of messing around with equipment for as long as I have, you get a bit of a sense of how kind of launch and spin and speed all relate to each other. And I guess overall how equipment relates to that and this great skill word that they I think are rightfully using, but we'll get into that more. And also I've some friends of mine that I've been involved in simulator technology with had an independent golf ball testing service, which didn't work as a business. It was a subscription, but we got a good insight. They did a lot of testing, got all the balls, did bench testing, compression testing, quality testing, which gave us a real insight into how balls are made and what really goes on there. And of course, under Sounder, I've been going around trying to get a ball manufactured that meets up to the balls that the big boys make and trying to sell at a lower price. So yes, I have had a bit of experience with golf balls, not least whacking them round.
I think you said you've hit 1 million in your time.
We tried to work that out the other day, but there's probably a few. I've hit about 182 so far today. Mostly wedges after this weekend.
Right. So can you help just tell us, taking a ball to market, what are the current restrictions, what are the current constraints on balls? How have they changed in your time? I saw a statement from Acushnet before we started to record this, which talks about bifurcating and going back to, it uses the 1990s because I think that's the easy watershed moment to reflect back to as being like, for the recreational golf for the dark ages when life was tougher, So where's the ball at now and where was it before? So kind of what are we dealing with today?
So the thing that needs to be said there is that is absolutely what Acushnet have said there in their statement is completely ridiculous. It's just totally incorrect what they're saying, and it goes to show, I think, how and also I think we've obviously both just sat through the webinar from the USGA and the R&A, and what was interesting is the language that the R&A and the USGA are using. It is quite sort of I wouldn't say combative, but it's definitely like they're showing a serious amount of resolve to try and confront this problem, and I think that's an interesting point for us to get into later on when it comes to what they've actually been able to do, even with that level of resolve, which might not be as much as people might think. So I guess to your question, evolution of golf balls for me, I mean, I grew up playing a Titleist Bellata or a Max Fly Bellata or whatever. And I always remember when Pro V1 came out as an assistant pro at Flatwell Heath Golf Club, and I hit one on 17, which is a par 5. And it went, really significantly further. Now, how much of that is technology and how much of it is just a change? And I think it's important to get into that, because really what the Pro V1 ball was was a harder ball than a Balata and also a lower spinning ball, which meant that good players hit that ball a lot further off the tee, because the Balatas, if you were looking at optimum distance, the Balatas spun a bit too much, which takes distance away. And the Pro V1 spun a lot less, and so it went a lot further. Pro V1 and these things are not linear. So a lower spinning ball off the tee isn't necessarily good for all golfers. And I think that's one of the things that is very much part of somebody like Titleist's message, which is sort of play what the pros play. And if it's good for the pros, it's good for everyone, which isn't necessarily the case. So when Pro V1 came along, I mean, that was the big moment in terms of golf balls.
I played a professional before that. I'm pretty sure I played a professional was the ball, that was closer to the Pro V1, correct?
Yeah.
Harder compound, like harder casing.
Yeah, definitely harder, and it was balls moving towards having solid cores. Back in the Balata days, balls would have, I don't know if you ever cut a Balata open. It was
rubber bands around the things.
Yeah, it used to go mad. You could pull the bands, and it would fly off all over the place, and then it had this liquid center. So it's sort of quite organic compared to a modern ball. Modern balls today, generally speaking, are either tour balls. Certainly, are either 3-piece, 4-piece, or 5-piece. They all have a urethane cover. In terms of technology, I would say that where we've got to today is that the balls that the big guys make, Bridgestone, Titleist, Srixon, they are all tailor-made. Obviously, they all have very durable covers. So these urethane covers have become very durable. And there's definitely a bit of wizardry when you get to the really top balls in terms of what they're able to do with covers. And then in terms of the other factors that really affect a ball relative to this conversation, I mean, there's quality, which you can test by weight and things like that. But the other factors that really relate to this conversation are the way that they behave in terms of how much they spin, both off the drivers and off the wedges, and the irons, of course, and the actual compression on the ball. And if you look at some of the trends that emerge that probably never get spoken about. Tour balls were starting about 5 years ago. Tour balls, if you sort of independently tested compression and things like that, they were getting quite hard, and they've just eased that up a bit recently. And all of that is trend.
What does compression mean? It's how soft the ball is.
Yeah, it's literally if you squash it, how much will it resist that squashing? So
and high resistance to the squash equals longer distance generally, or more speed.
So for me, there's a sort of there's an optimum amount to compress a golf ball. So there is no way that you or I, let alone my dad, should be using the same ball as Dustin Johnson. That is pretty fanciful, but that doesn't necessarily get spoken about very much. There is a sort of optimum compression. I think if you were, if we were big enough at Sounder to do whatever we wanted to do in terms of golf balls, one of the biggest things that I would really like to do is to produce speed rated balls which are optimized for different players. And manufacturers have tried to do that in the past, and it hasn't worked very well. Callaway did a thing; it was actually called SR, speed rated, and Bridgestone do a good job with that because they have the balls that are very clearly BRXS and BRS and all that stuff. So Freddie Couples uses the one in the green box, which is the softer one, even though he still rips it. But and Tiger now has gone from the really hard tour ball in the Bridgestone to the blue one, which I think is called a BRX, or they're very confusing names to them. It's the one in the blue box. And I, in my own game, I go between the one in the blue box and the one in the green box, which is the softest one, the one in the green box, based on, sometimes if it's really cold and it's windy, a softer ball for me, actually, kind of with the mid irons and with the short irons, goes through the air a bit better because it's more compressed and it actually comes out with a bit less spin.
Okay. So takeaways, a lot of the amateur players may be playing the balls a bit too harder. These rollback, we said called rollback, whatever we're going to call it. This is targeted, and this is the first bit of phraseology that we're going to need to clear up. Elite players, which is a word I love, but is pretty vague because I get the sense they're putting professional golf, and because that whole webinar thing was quite, they were very kind of calculated with their phrases. I think elite meaning, I'm guessing, high level amateur events and for the professional game?
Yeah, I think it's a bad word, elite. Maybe they would have been better off using scratch golf or something like that. But where do you draw the line for that?
Mhm.
That's I think one of the big questions here. I mean, I suppose the key thing is if we just go through what the actual rule is. So to give you an idea, that there's a number of tests. There's quite a few tests that the RNA do if you make a golf ball, and you have to send it in and pay them some money, and they get back to you. And they're brilliant organisation. The RNA, they're very organised, so they get back to you in a set amount of time. They're bang on with everything, and they do a number of tests. One that they do kind of compression tests. They do this circumference test, which is actually one of the hardest ones to pass. You can get rejected on that one just on the tolerances. You just send them a batch and it doesn't quite get through, and you send them another batch and it gets through, but it's not a different ball. So that's one of the trickiest ones. But the key test, and the one that this is all about, is that if they hit a ball with 120 club head speed, what is it? How far does it go? What's the total distance that it goes? And they made proposals in the initial consultation where they said, actually, elite players on tour. So we're not talking about elite players in terms of elite amateurs. These are the absolute top
elite scratch forces players, or
not
elite
us,
club championship wannabes. Anyone that sits in that bill. No, it's not category 1 players.
Yeah, it's their inside 5% of the fastest players on tour. So average on tour is 114 miles an hour of club head speed,
which is still very high for the recreational player.
Yeah, the highest players on tour now are approaching 130, but very few of them. It's about 3% of players on tour that are getting up to this 127 number. So the RNA and the USGA proposed that they would create a new test, which was at 127 miles per hour. And one of the things that they said they wanted to do was that they wanted to, and it's quite an undertaking this, they wanted every time they got a ball to calibrate the swing robot so that the launch and spin was optimized for that particular ball. So all the balls will do slightly different things when it comes to launch and spin. And they wanted to create a test where it was optimized for that particular ball. And at those completely optimized conditions, the ball couldn't go further than what's the number? It's 317, isn't it? 317 yards carry. So the manufacturers pushed back on that, and the manufacturers said, no, you can't do that because that will mess up all our development processes, and we could get all the way into developing a ball and then find out it doesn't work.
But also create a ranking of balls as well, I'm guessing.
Yeah, that would be a bit of an odd one, and there are a lot of things within this that are a bit hard to get your head around. So anyway, that's basically what they've done, and now they've come back and said, okay, we will do that at a set launch condition, which is 11-degree launch and 2,220 RPMs of spin. And what they will do is they will send out to, as a ball manufacturer now, you can buy these test balls from the RNA, which you can do your own testing on and try and figure out how that compares to what you're going to get tested on when you submit the ball. So I'm that I think is a bit tricky. These swing robots are not quite as robotic as people tend to think, and they've sort of alluded to the fact that there might be a better way of doing that. So I'm sure they'll come back on that. So it might not be the most perfect test.
So what does that mean then? So at 127 or whatever, at the launch angle and RPMs you mentioned there, like, is there any way you can work out what that means versus a threshold of 317? Like, is that stuff that the pros would be blowing by if they delivered the club at those numbers?
Well, to give you an idea, so we were talking about this earlier. So 1.49 is the average smash factor on tour. So that's the ratio of club head speed versus ball speed. How good
1.5 is the max. So that's pretty elite ball speed.
Yeah, that's crazy. Not many people are getting to that. So, but at 1.49 average on tour, that gets you to 189 miles per hour of ball speed. And with 11-degree launch and 2,200 spin, that gets a shot that carries 322 and runs out to 355 based on the sort of the ball flight model, the USGA's ball flight model. So I've got a calculator on my thing which plugs into that. So that's based on the USGA ball flight model. So really, if you've got somebody who has got that type of ball speed, under this rule, they probably lose 5 yards. So
even
it
though
really
they said
is
there's a tolerance of 3 yards as well, didn't they?
tolerance
So
of 3 yards.
technically,
Yeah.
you could
So
go to
it's
320. So we're kind of there.
what they're doing. This is a real sort of slamming of the back door. They're sort of they're sort of saying that this is the limit. Now so they're not. It's been done quite carefully. They're calling it a rollback. They're really avoiding this bifurcation word. They're really, I noticed in the webinar, they really didn't want to get drawn
It's
on that.
MLR,
Really,
right?
Yeah, they didn't want to use this bifurcation word. And I think that always looming in the background of these things is the potential that manufacturers could decide to take USGA and RNA to court. And obviously that's the last thing they want, because that would just get into a big spending competition. So they're quite careful. I think that's probably why there has to be a local rule. In practice, the average golfer is not going to see any difference whatsoever. The rule doesn't come in for another 3 years. There's a couple of very interesting tests that we could do potentially. It'd be very difficult to do without a swing robot, and I think that there'll probably be a degree of reluctance to let this
I'll
sort of
happily
information.
provide my own services.
We could use you. Yeah, that's true. I didn't think of that. Yeah. But the most interesting test for me would be, okay, let's take all the balls that are being used on tour at the moment, and let's find out which ones at those launch conditions are over, and which ones are under. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're a better or worse ball. It just means they do something different. And what's interesting is when you ask a manufacturer to produce a ball which so by the way, I should say the numbers that I've given you here are sort of based on a Pro V1. What the
but some of them will react slightly differently, won't they? Like
some will be different, and the differences will be so really what the manufacturers have a few options. There's quite a lot of ways that they could bring these balls under that distance limit. And the thing I would stress here, and I think we need to get into this thing of skill versus distance and everything, is these factors aren't necessarily things that make a ball worse. They're just things that make a ball different. It's just that everybody at the moment seems to be talking about distance, as if that's the only factor. So one thing they could do is that at that very high speed, they could make the ball lower compression. So lower compression at those speeds definitely loses some speed. It loses at lower ball speeds, it loses less speed, and that's something that is really quite controversial, because that is starting to suggest that what's good for the elite players, I'm talking like the elite ball smashers on tour, isn't necessarily good for the average player. So that's quite interesting. So they could make the ball lower compression. They could make the ball a little bit higher spinning. So if you take a golfer, I'm just going to load this up. I should have had this loaded up before. But if you take a golfer who it goes the other way as well. So if you took a golfer who gets that ball speed but launches it at 13 degrees with a slightly lower spin rate, they will pick up, where I'm saying at those launch conditions that they would get 322 carry. Sorry, so I have to load up the old Windows program to get in.
I was going to say, it looks like a MacBook you've got the phone rested on.
It is, and then I've got this
Parallels Windows thing. It was weird.
I've got this Parallels desktop thing because all my launch monitor stuff is on Windows.
But you're right. While you're doing that, there's the big, and Martin Slumbers talked about it a lot in the webcast, was this concept of I see golf as a game of skill, right? And that was one of the things that came through very strongly. The whole idea about this being an MLR, a model local rule, and you just need to clarify what that is. But back to that point about skill, I suppose you can throttle back distance, but if you do it in a completely linear fashion, then you're still rewarding long drivers or the monsters on tour to exactly the same extent you are today. Whereas perhaps if you look at ball conditions that may be, like you say, softer compression, then all of a sudden it narrows the delta between Rory and Kevin Kisner, to give you two examples, one short hitter, one longer hitter, they're trying to compete with each other. If you narrow the delta, then arguably it would give Kisner the leg up over Rory.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it comes down to what, and this is always seems to be a conversation that everybody wants to ignore, but ultimately, what it comes down to is what is the type of golf that we want to see, and what are the skills that we want to see rewarded. And what's happened these days is that you have a low spinning ball, and you have pros now are playing. They're playing like pretty much the total. The big driver head sizes. There was a time when pros would use 420 heads and stuff like that. That doesn't happen so much anymore. All the pros are using 460 heads, and all the pros are using these heads which are geared up towards very high MOI. Now, there is a trade-off to a very high MOI, which is moment of inertia. It's how forgiving a club is, how much it resists twisting. There is a trade-off to that, which is that they're not quite as nice to hit, in my opinion, because they just feel a bit dead. But also, you can't really be creative and you can't do anything with them. But so what we've got now is a generation of players who have grown up with very high MOI, very forgiving driver heads, and a very low spinning ball. And they've also grown up in a game which has trended. This isn't necessarily progress. The game has trended towards a style of play where players are a bit less creative and it's more about distance. So players are just, it's the bomb and gouge thing. So they get it miles up there. They have a brilliant wedge game. They're brilliant putters. And for most of the weeks and most of the courses that they play, they can completely get away with that. That's an optimized way of it. That might not be quite as effective in the majors, but if you look at what happened with Bryson at Winged Foot, the USGA really got found out on its thinking about narrowing fairways there, because it just totally backfired on them there.
Yeah,
so what's
played
happened
totally into his hands, didn't it? I mean,
yeah, exactly.
That was the setup to reward a massive hitter.
Yeah, so we have a generation of players now who have grown up around hitting the ball as hard as they possibly can. They don't have to control the spin on the ball, and they don't necessarily have to hit the middle of the driving face. And that's not me being a moaning old man. That's just a fact. It's just that is what's happened. So their games have developed in that way. And so when drivers hit the limit, so when did the COR limit come in? I mean, that must be that sort of 2003,
What's
2004.
COR?
So it's coefficient of restitution. So when the Callaway ERC came out, and the TaylorMade R580, I think it was, they had this extra trampoline effect on the face, which was due to titanium heads, and they put a limit on the. They'd already sold some of those drivers, so amateurs were allowed to use those drivers for about another 6 years, pros for a couple of years, whatever. And they put that limit on. So drivers were on the limit all the way back then. And since then, no manufacturer has been able to produce a driver that when you whack it out of the middle of the face, it goes any further than any of the other drivers. Distance is obviously the story that sells, but that is a fact. I'm not saying that drivers haven't got a bit better and they've probably become easier to hit and a bit more forgiving, but they've been on that limit for that whole period of time. So the gains that we've seen over the last 20 years have really been about a style of play and a style of golfer. They haven't really had that much to do with equipment.
Okay. So then the motivations for doing this then, from the R&A and the USGA standpoint, so they've introduced the model local rule, and there are millions of model local rules, we should say, within the game's rule book. So this is anything that would constitute something you can substitute in at the discretion of the tournament organizer or the club or the course itself, right? Anything from spike shoes to use of green books to interpretation of boundary hazards and water, whatever it might be. So the idea that they put this forward, to an extent, do you think it sort of devolves the R&A and the USGA from mandating a certain ball prescription or a certain limit on the ball and devolves it back down to the tournament? So what I mean by that would be Bay Hill could go, do you know what, it's fine, just leave the ball as it is for us, because that produces the tournament we want. Whereas Hilton Head or, wherever we might have it, that might be perhaps a shorter course or somewhere they want to protect the relevance of the venue, because it might be all of a sudden starting to feel like it's, I'm not saying Sawgrass is too easy, because I mean, it's, with the exception of Scheffler, like it was a tough setup, but the guys were hitting irons and 3-woods up to 12, weren't they? Like it wasn't, that thing's 305, 310. It's not a challenge. Now, therefore, the MLR thing, that model local rule, they've essentially devolved that, haven't they, back to, if they can get it through, subject to and from 2026.
I guess, yeah. Look, it's going to be down. There's going to be big decisions made, and the USGA and the RNA said on the webinar just now. They said that they're absolutely implementing it for the Open and for the US Open. The interesting thing, I would imagine, I don't see any reason why Augusta would not. The USPGA will be the interesting one, because I have heard on the grapevine that they've been one of the big resistors of this, which is understanding, because PGA members sell golf equipment and they're very influenced by the manufacturers. The interesting thing will be the PGA Tour. Will the PGA Tour say we will implement this for all of our tournaments? I don't think the PGA Tour will be able to say we'll leave it up to the tournament. And the reason for that is that I think that the superstars, the players, will moan. I don't think that they will want to have to change balls, and the other thing is that the professional golfers, and the equipment manufacturers are unfortunately short-term thinkers. Equipment manufacturers are big companies. Some of them are public companies, and those companies aren't going to think more than 3 years out, and they're also not going to necessarily think about what's good for the game. And if the pros say what they really think, which might be contrary to what's in the best interest of their sponsors, they're probably going to have a rough time. So there's this thing that goes on at the top of the game. And I think the other thing is you can see how this is all a bit wrapped up in there was a lot of people that are the sort of real avid followers of the big manufacturers who sort of listen to what the pros are saying, which was this thing about why are the governing bodies looking to hold back progress? And I think that's a bit of a stretch, really. They're not there looking to hold back progress, but I think that they should be allowed to regulate the game that we all play. I mean, if you think about something like Formula One, they change the specifications of the cars. Sometimes they make the cars so they don't handle quite as well, because it leads to better racing and more overtaking. And I realise that Formula One, people that watch Formula One aren't buying Formula One cars, so that's probably why it's different. But there's a lot of stuff in here which is the stuff that they're unable to do, or it's very difficult for them to do because of the resistance and because of the optics and because of the messaging. And the other thing is, I wonder whether if the USGA and the RNA were aware of the turmoil that LIV was going to create at this point. I mean, this process was already set in motion, wasn't it? Probably 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, it was a few years ago when they opened up for this study or whatever, and
they might not have opened this can of worms, because I think all of the allegiances.
Why do you say that?
Because I just think all of the allegiances at the sort of top of the game. So I guess USGA, RNA, PGA Tour, European Tour, Augusta, and the USPGA. Probably a little bit fractured and a little bit strained at the moment, just because I think when all of those organizations were operating in sync, there was time. There was time to kind of think about this stuff and to take a long time to work on it. But maybe that's not so much the case now. And I think the most interesting thing in many ways is what will LIV say. If you go back to even take something like anchoring, they couldn't really ban long putters, because that was banning a certain type of club, and that was restricting a business's ability to sell their products. And so that's definite court case territory. But you could ban anchoring because that was a way of using those clubs. But the problem was it had taken so long. I mean, when did the first anchored putter come out? Sam Torrance back in the late 80s. It had taken so long that there was a whole generation.
So big, so quickly. We were talking about this at the weekend. Like, everyone was on them, weren't they, for a period? It was like every week you'd have half a dozen pros that were all of a sudden belly puttering.
But also there was a generation of players that had grown up using those putters, and they weren't quite sure whether they were still going to be able to operate at the top of the game. I think Webb Simpson, Keegan Bradley, those are the players that sort of spring to mind. But actually, they've adapted and they've done okay. But I think at that point, there probably was a certain amount of pressure with the PGA Tour from certain players who ultimately run the tour to say, why don't we just not go along with this rule, because we've got a load of players that still want to be able to go on and make a living. So it's at any point, these type of changes probably do stretch those relationships. And certainly whether Liv, I don't think Liv will they? I don't think Liv will adopt these.
If anything, it
rules
would give
at all.
them something to go against. I mean, you mentioned to me when we were talking about it before, if the manufacturers doubled down on aerodynamics, they could actually unlock another gear of distance out of this thing.
That's so I'm told. Yeah, that is something.
And then, like,
which
you could have a live ball that would go like 600 yards. I want to ask about the ladies stuff. So the women's game came up on the webinar. The question was, is there anything in the women's game that causes you concern? And I think it was quite an interesting point, that wasn't it, in the kind of how they spun it, because this was back to the reason I asked that, because it speaks to the question of, is it about the relative difference in players and to what extent we're rewarding distance, or is it to do with the relevance of the courses and how we keep them as, you know, do we have to keep lengthening everything to 8,000, 8,500 to remain a relevant tournament course? And I think they're two different objectives with this. Is it fair to say?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think that it was interesting when somebody asked about the women's game in the webinar. It's definitely something where, you know, when I think Martin Slumbers was asked about this, whether he said, "Do you think there's a distance problem?" The question was, "Do you think there's a distance problem in the women's game?" Which he said that there isn't. You know, they've got plenty of room to work backwards with the tees and all of that stuff. But the most interesting thing about that was that, you know, a couple of years back, I thought this was a really good move, was that the RNA moved away from talking about distance and moved towards talking about skill and wanting to see a little bit more balance of skill in the game. You know, they just feel, and rightly so, they're completely right to feel this, because it's totally out of control, in my opinion. But the skill balance in the game, so control, ball flight control, all of those things, that we're not saying that the players today don't have them, but they certainly don't have them to as great a degree, in favor of the balance of skill being more towards just power and being able to hit the ball a long way, and not needing to work the ball. So the skill debate still exists in the ladies' game in the same way as it would in the men's game. It's just that we are definitely watching. I would say, you know, certainly the Open Championship. Maybe not so much the US Open, because they do change the course so dramatically. But I would say that the Open has certainly been compromised by distance. I mean, this debate was going on the other day, wasn't it, about whether they're going to go for the first at Hoylake this year. So it's the Open is, there's always that debate about, you know, is the old course going to hold up? And there's a lot of courses on the open rotor that are struggling with this, and so we've sort of, that the horse has already bolted on that one. Fair enough, it's not going to get miles worse now. It's not going to get
it's
worse.
Not going to go back, is it? It's fair to say,
no.
Looking at the numbers that you've looked at there, and when you sort of put it into the calculator and say, well, okay, you take tour striking ability, you model that based on a Pro V1 or whatever, you know, at best, if the manufacturers had to go back and redevelop the golf ball for 2026, and it could go no further than that, they would only be compromised to the tune of 3 or 4, maybe 5 yards at the top end. And that would be a linear reduction for all players. So, you know, if Rory lost 5 yards, so would Kisner. You know, there's
yeah,
that.
That's basically not achievable. You know, somebody always loses and somebody always gains. You know, we lost some players when Pro V1 became the prominent bull. There were some players that just couldn't keep going the way that they were going. And I guess the question we all have to ask ourselves is, if anybody debates that there's a difference in the style of play, you sort of have to ask yourself, you know, are we ever going to have a Corey Pavin or a David Toms again, or a Ben Crenshaw again? Because I don't think we've really got any of those at the moment. You know, even probably the nearest thing we've had to that in recent years is a Luke Donald, and he doesn't really get out much anymore. So it's definitely the skill thing. The problem with the skill thing is that if you really decided, which I think that they have decided, they want to get back to a slightly different version of the game. The problem is it's not achievable because the task is too great. So I've given this a ton of thought. I mean, you have to consider it in a more nuanced way, because it's like, what is the reaction from the players? How does the game change based on the rules things that you put in place? So, for example, you're not going to get that much reduction out of the golf ball without doing something dramatic with it, making, less dimples or something, which would just sort of compromise it, make it completely different.
90 compression would be quite cool.
Yeah. So if you just took, if you, for argument's sake, this is what I would do if I ruled the world. I would say, I would get them playing on much lower compression ball with a higher spin rate, have a tournament spec at a certain speed. The ball couldn't spin any less than, for argument's sake, 3,000 RPMs, and couldn't come off the face any faster than X. So it's a bit more of a definite ruling in terms of what the ball can actually do. So a lower compression ball that spins more. I would then limit the driver head size, and you wouldn't have to limit it that much. I think if I ruled the world, I'd probably make it 380, maybe even 360.
Yeah, the drivers today go 400, and there would be a much bigger premium on where you're hitting it on the face, isn't there?
Yeah, so you go 400, and then what happens is player A, player B goes in and does their testing on a launch monitor, and they have a bit of a dilemma, which is that in order to get huge amounts of distance out of that ball, they will still be able to hit it mild, but in order to do it, they will have to start playing a much lower loft. So if you go back to really showing my age here, but if you go back to the early days of metal woods, the tailor-made burner, tiny little metal-headed wood, but with a Bellata ball, players on tour, there's the old tour burner that was 7 degrees of loft. I think if you took a titanium driver, so a modern driver, and wanted it to play anywhere near the equivalent of that driver at 7 degrees of loft, you'd probably be playing 5 degrees of loft. Now, what happens when you play that low loft to keep the spin off is it gets squirrely. The ball, if you mishit it,
squirrely. Can we just get a bit more? Can we get a bit more fact on this rather than your jargon?
If you get that lower spin with a higher spinning ball, if you absolutely nut one, it's as good as it would be with the low spinning ball and the modern and what players are using today. But if you just miss it a little bit, it's going a long way offline. And it's not going to fly
rapidly.
Yeah. So what you're doing is you create a bit of jeopardy to hitting the ball a long way. So if we see somebody carry the water at 360, we know that they have taken a massive risk to do that. Which for me, that's what makes the game entertaining. That would make the game a lot more entertaining if we knew that it was a bit harder. The golf we were watching was a bit harder. Now you have to ask yourself, the question is, would you or I enjoy that? Personally, I do enjoy that, and that's why I take out the Simon Woods, and that's why I've been messing around with an old Titleist metal driver from not even titanium, just an old metal one. Personally, I do think that is quite fun. It's quite difficult to take the step to do it because you're just making the game a bit harder, but it's more rewarding when you hit a good one. But regardless of that, that's the only way that you would get to this sort of stated objective, which is to introduce some more skill to the game. And it's not. The point I really want to make here is that the people that can hit the ball really long could still hit it really long with that stuff, but it wouldn't be available to everyone. It would only be available to the absolute best ball strikers, and the other people would have to make some compromise. Might have to play a bit more loft. Would have to give themselves to stop themselves from getting the real squirters, and they would sacrifice distance, and they would have something to work on. I'm not saying they're not brilliant players or elite players, but they would have something to work on to be able to get up to those distances.
The best players would figure it out, though, wouldn't they?
Yes,
and the best players would just figure it out. There'd be some people, and this is that's where it's like a generational thing. The guys that are maybe in their mid to late 30s probably still have a bit of flexibility in terms of it because they've probably played with different types of product. The guys that are coming out of NCAA at the moment have only ever known what it's like to just bludgeon a driver, absolutely flat out.
And bear in mind that also this rule doesn't really do anything to solve the issue around the way those players are going to develop their games. So, if you're an NCAA guy and you're just bought into it all, you think it's all progress. You think that every single trend is progress. Every single new thing is progress. You're still going to be trying to get yourself up to 127 club head speed, which is incredibly elite. The reason that the average club speed, so I'm more of a ball speed guy. So the average club speed on tour now is 115. It's not 127. Yeah. It's 115. And at 149 smash factor, that gets you to 171 miles an hour ball speed. Well, back in 2005-ish, So when TaylorMade R7 was out and all that stuff, average on tour was 160 ball speed. So average on tour over that 15-year period has gone up by
and some
11,
of that's
12,
forgiveness
11,
in the
12 miles an
head,
hour.
and a little bit more kind of better smash factor as an average. But then there's a lot in there that's built into club head speed and how fast they're delivering it.
Most of it is down to down to club speed. So most of it in that period is down to a style of play. So if you're an NC, you can get an NCAA scholarship these days. You can get a college scholarship in the US based on TrackMan numbers. It's a great way of this might be a bit controversial, but it's a really great way of bad
for that. Don't worry.
It's a really great way of bad coaches to hide the fact that they're bad coaches, and to hide sort of real knowledge about how to hit a golf ball is to completely align yourself with the numbers.
Where does this go next then? So the equipment manufacturers have now got a period until mid-August, I think, which is about 5 months, to opine on this. All the other stakeholders, so I'm guessing Augusta National, LPGA, USPGA, all the different stakeholders in the game will have a chance to feed in. We've already seen a bit of mudslinging from Acushnet on the topic. So I suppose, one, what happens next in terms of what do we expect to see? Two, is this bifurcation? Because that was the word used by Titleist. RNA, USGA seem to be really clear this is not bifurcation. It's almost like bifurcation has become a swear word in the game a little bit, because we never want to say that's what it is, because that could disenfranchise all the people that are so into the game.
Yeah, and it's a court case waiting to happen as well. So, the moment that you do that is because what you're doing at that point is you're taking away the ability. Titleist sells golf equipment on playing what the pros play. There's a reason when you go to regional qualifying for the Open, you get given 6 Titleist balls in the car park so that they can win the ball count. But what I would describe this as a 5-iron off the tee in the final hole of a major from the RNA and the USGA, but they're 4 back. So they're already behind, but this is a very safe play. And what it is, it's the opening salvos, because now there's going to be erection from the equipment companies. Now, that you've got to remember, the equipment companies will act in a pretty sort of psychopathic fashion. So what the equipment companies will do is they'll make as much noise about this. Yeah, and they'll make as much noise about this as they would if they'd have said you've got to use 390cc heads. They'll just go mad to try and limit the ability of the governing bodies to do more in the future. This is just now a battle. And the problem for the governing bodies, and I think the real problem that needs to be solved, is that the manufacturers do a very good job of communication, and they have the puppets who are their sponsored players in the form of the pros. So the vast majority of the pros are going to come out straight away, and they're going to read off the hymn sheet in their sleep. And there's going to be a load of golfers who are still very bought into what the pros are playing and what the pros are saying, who are then going to scream that as if that's the truth. And sadly, it isn't. But so I think that's what's going to happen. I mean, that statement that's just come out from Titleist is I was pretty surprised by that. I was pretty surprised
as well, wasn't it? It's like,
an
angry letter from somebody who's just seen it and just knee-jerked on it.
Yeah, well, that was ready to rock, wasn't it? Should we just pull that up? Because there's a couple of things in there that are quite interesting. I mean, one of the things that struck me was that they've gone straight. They've just, they've made it very clear in the statements and in the webinar that this is not bifurcation. But they've just gone straight in and used the word bifurcation. This argument, I know, which was in there about they think one of the great appeals of the game is that players are playing the same equipment as the pros and playing the same game as the pros. I mean, that is pretty difficult to defend. And it's one of the things that creates a lot of issues that the game faces today, really, is that idea. Because, we're not playing the same game as the pros. The pros are on a different planet in terms of what they're doing with golf clubs and what they're able to do in terms of dialing in their equipment and all that sort of thing. It's madness to say that, really. So what have we got here? Yeah, so if I think some of the sort of wording in here is that, you know, unification is a positive force in the game, and we believe that equipment bifurcation would be detrimental to golf's long-term well-being. As a result, we will actively participate, resist in this conversation and with the governing bodies. I think that, you know, the issue with this, and I think when they say that if the testing changes are improved, we will have to make balls for the elite players to meet one set of testing standards and making different balls to meet the current set of testing standards for club players. I think that that's a bit of a reach, really. I mean, they're not. This is not a massive.
It's very
change.
punchy.
Yeah, and look, this is not a massive change to the golf ball. This will slide through. There will, unless there's a commercial reason to actually have different balls, they will not even need to have different balls. It's just completely ludicrous to say that. This is such a small change to the ball. And, you know, if, in my opinion, equipment companies are being quite short-sighted on this, because I think that the problem is that, you know, going back to the short-term thinking, it's very difficult for them to see any other business model. But for me, the idea that players are going to go out each and every year and buy the latest driver because they're being told it goes further is probably already in decline and will decline further. And I think if you started to move things in a direction where golfers, they took part in this, if they took part in bringing skill back to the game, the other thing that comes with skill is a much more enjoyable version of the game for people like us and for everyone else. And the clubs are nicer to look at. The clubs are nicer to play with. There's a reason why I use an 06 R7 Super Quad, because it performs just as well. And it's much nicer to hit. I just love that
thing. I mean, look, it's all going to come out in the next few days and weeks and months and stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see how much noise there is about what is really a bit of it's not quite storm in a teacup. Like you say, it's a really small change, and it's going to be interesting to see just how much noise there is over something, how little the manufacturers are going to be prepared to concede ground on. Like, this is a small thing, right?
And what I think, you know, I would like to say on that is, it's just like, you know, that shows how little the manufacturers really care about the well-being of the game. It's not, you know, that's why I say this is a 5-iron off the tee in the final hole of a major, and the R&A and the USGA are behind at the moment, is that it's a really safe one. You know, it's really testing what the reaction is going to be. It's really testing, you know, what the where the lawyers get involved, and I'm sure that this is worded in a way where there isn't too much ground for doing that. But if the golf's governing bodies are going to be able to regulate the game in a meaningful way, this battle is going to have to be fought, and it's going to have to be fought over much more sort of contentious areas and bigger changes than this one. You know, this one it's not a rollback. It potentially it's a 5-yard rollback for people in the top 2 or 3%.
It's putting the seawalls up before you've got the coastal erosion, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think even if you took what was happening under the existing rules, it couldn't go too much further. I think what was good, and again, this is that really shaky territory that nobody wants to get into, is the questions that you have to ask is why do they have to test these balls at a higher speed? And the answer to that is, the reason they have to test them at a higher speed is because actually, with the way that tour balls are made, the top players get a much bigger benefit than your average player. And the interesting question is, what will happen to, you know, what will they do to the ball to get under that?
Any other sort of parting gifts on the topic?
No, not really. I mean, it's going to be interesting to watch, isn't it? I don't know whether I'm having a bit of after reading that Titleist announcement that made me feel a bit grim. I think I might check out of this one. I might stay away from all the sort of all the media on it. I think it's going to do my head in. But look, hopefully, the only way that this is really going to sort itself out for the good of the game is that if the manufacturers start to take part in it and start to realise that actually this might not be bad for their business, and a bit of unification about why people really play golf. It's not really about watching the pros on TV. It's not really about trying to be like the pros on TV. There's a whole world out there of people that are going out there and having a great time and playing for slightly different reasons. So
like I'd feel maybe a little bit different if the pros were playing with 400cc heads and I was stood there with 460. I can kind of see it. If they're using a ball that's going 5-10 yards left, I mean, it's not bifurcation, is it? The fact is, if I go and play a tournament course, there's no way I'm going back and playing it at full tournament distance if I play sawgrass. But then even so, there's no way I'm playing it anything close to tournament spec. Like those greens are like absolute concrete. And
you would
they're
have
seriously
a horrible
quick.
time.
Yeah, and I'd have a horrible time. So it's just like, it's not a comparison. Like no one looks at course setup as being a way of bifurcating, but that's exactly what happens. So
it's a crazy argument. And the other thing is it's really about sort of manipulating the message, and ultimately that probably, I don't know. I mean, I did a little bit of research on this myself when we were starting Sounder. Which was that I went through GolfWorks, which is a nerdy equipment website I'm sure most of your listeners are familiar with, but there's a thing at the bottom about how people would react to articles. And I went through articles that were quite sort of counter to the overall narrative from manufacturers and stuff like that. And I measured the reactions. And I sort of thought to myself that based on the very nerdy niche audience on GolfWorks, that about 30% of that audience were quite up for hearing that stuff, but 70% were absolutely committed to the narrative that comes out of the pros and comes out of the manufacturers. So that is a loud voice, and that does build a lot of momentum. And the manufacturers are better at comms than the governing bodies. And maybe that's
PR wise, you see the club stuff in January versus, the wider PR. So it's a PR battle. James, you're a superstar. Thanks for joining. Thanks, and always I'm looking forward to speaking to you soon.
Okay. See you soon.
Bye.